I am a researcher of the Titanic. A recently discovered artifact has left me traumatized. I've spent my entire professional life studying the Titanic, but nothing could have prepared me for how deeply the ship would eventually consume me. My name is Dr. Michael Hartley, and I'm a maritime historian specializing in the RMS Titanic. For 20 years, I've dedicated my life to understanding every minute detail of that tragic voyage, the passengers, the crew, the intricate social dynamics, the fatal design flaws. What began as academic fascination gradually transformed into an obsession that would ultimately unravel my entire perception of reality. The artifact came from a private collection in Southampton. An elderly collector, Harold Jameson, had contacted me after hearing about my reputation. He claimed to have something unusual, personal effects recovered from the wreckage that had never been properly documented. Most researchers would have been skeptical, but my hunger for untold stories always outweighed my caution. When the package arrived, it was surprisingly modest. A small leather satchel, water-stained and fragile, contained what appeared to be personal documents, a tarnished locket, and a small fragment of fabric. The moment my fingers brushed against the itterns, something felt different. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. The fabric was what caught my attention first. A small, roughly triangular piece of third-class passenger clothing, coarse dark wool with intricate stitching. As I examined it under my magnifying glass, the edge unexpectedly caught my skin. A thin, precise cut opened across my palm, tiny droplets of blood immediately welling up. I should have cleaned the wound immediately. I should have been more careful. But something about the artifact held me transfixed. The blood seemed to absorb into the fabric, not seep, not stain, but absorb, like the material was drinking it. For a split second, I could have sworn the fabric's color deepened, becoming richer, more vibrant. That was the first moment I heard the whispers, faint at first. So quiet I initially thought it was the wind or the ambient noise of my study. Fragmented words in a language that felt both foreign and intimately familiar. Desperate, terrified. No escape. Water rising. God help me, I dismissed it as imagination. Exhaustion from weeks of intense research. But as the days progressed, the whispers became more persistent, more defined. By the third night, I knew something fundamental had changed. The dreams began. Vivid, horrifyingly detailed nightmares that felt less like dreams and more like memories. I wasn't just observing numb, was experiencing, I was Thomas. Thomas Riley, a 22-year-old Irish immigrant from a small village outside Dublin. Third-class passenger, dreaming of a better life in America, scraped together every penny for that ticket on the Titanic. In these dreams, these memories, I could feel the cramped conditions of steerage, the smell of unwashed bodies, the constant background noise of children crying, adults speaking in a dozen different languages, the hope, the desperation, and then the ice. The first impact was nothing like the dramatic Hollywood depictions, a subtle shudder. Most passengers didn't even realize something was wrong, but Thomas knew. Something in his bones understood the terrible mathematics of what was happening. Water. Cold, rising panic would come later. First would be the terrible, suffocating realization of doom. Each night, the dreams grew more intense. More real, I would wake up drenched in sweat, my lungs burning, convinced I was drowning. My sheets would be damp, smelling of salt and industrial coal smoke. Something was happening to me, something I couldn't explain. The cut on my hand didn't heal properly. What began as a simple wound transformed into something different. The skin around the cut remained perpetually raw, with an iridescent quality that shifted colors when caught in certain light. Blues and grays like deep ocean water. Sometimes, if I stared too long, I could swear the wound moved, not visibly, but with a subtle internal rippling. My research became increasingly erratic. Colleagues noticed the change. Dr. Elizabeth Moreau, my longtime research partner, approached me during a conference, her concern etched deep in the lines of her face. "Michael, you look terrible," she said, not unkindly. "When was the last time you slept?" I couldn't tell her about the dreams. About Thomas, about the memories that weren't mine. The artifacts from the Southampton collection began to consume my every waking moment. I cataloged them obsessively, discovering minute details that had escaped previous researchers. A ticket stub with a partial fingerprint, a fragment of a letter, water damaged but still partially legible, a brass button from a third-class steward's uniform. Each item seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't explain. The whispers grew stronger. During the day, they were subtle, background noise that could be mistaken for the hum of fluorescent lights or the distant murmur of traffic. But at night, they became a symphony of terror. Hundreds of voices, overlapping, desperate. The water. Can't breathe, too cold. I started keeping a journal, not for academic purposes, but as a desperate attempt to maintain my sanity, to track the progression of whatever was happening to me. Entry October 17th. The dreams are becoming more specific. I'm not just experiencing Thomas's memories. I'm beginning to understand his entire life, his hopes, his fears, the smell of his mother's bread, the calluses on his hands from working the fields, the weight of his single best suit purchased specifically for the journey to America. I know the exact moment he realized the ship was doomed. It wasn't a sudden revelation, not a dramatic moment of terror, just a slow, temble understanding that crept into his consciousness like ice-cold water. The cut on my hand started to change. Small, intricate patterns began to emerge around the wound. Patterns that looked like nautical maps, like the complex network of corridors inside the Titanic. Thin blue-gray lines that seemed to move when I wasn't directly looking at them. My sleep became a battlefield. One moment I was Dr. Michael Hartley, respected historian, meticulous researcher. The next I was Thomas Riley, poor, desperate, trapped. The boundary between us was dissolving, and something else was emerging. Something that had been waiting, buried deep beneath the cold Atlantic waters for over a century. Something that wanted to be remembered. By November, I was losing myself. My apartment became a sprawling archive of Titanic ephemera, walls covered in maritime maps, passenger lists, and photographs. But these weren't just historical documents anymore. They were alive, the photographs. God, the photographs. Third-class passengers, frozen in sepia-toned momenta, would shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Faces would turn slightly. Eyes would follow me. Not all of them, just select images. Always the ones showing people who would die that night. Thomas's memories were no longer confined to dreams. I could taste the salt water during faculty meetings, feel the impossible cold of the Atlantic while lecturing about maritime engineering. Sometimes, mid-sentence, I would forget who I was. Was I the professor or the desperate young immigrant clutching a wooden panel in freezing water? The wound on my hand had become a map. Literally, intricate blue-gray lines now formed a precise topographical representation of the Titanic's lower decks. If I traced the lines with my finger, I could feel the ship's internal layout, could sense the exact location of each corridor, each compartment, the precise angles where water would first breach the hull. Dr. Moreau stopped calling. My department chair suggested a sabbatical. I was becoming something else, something between historian and haunting. One night, I discovered something in Thomas's memories that chilled me more than the phantom maritime cold that now perpetually surrounded me. He wasn't supposed to be on that ship. His original ticket for a smaller vessel leaving a week earlier had been lost. Stolen, actually, by a man whose name was never recorded in any manifest. A man whose face Thomas remembered with a strange, specific terror. A man who seemed to know what was coming. The whispers grew more insistent, no longer just memories of terror and drowning. Now they carried something else, a warning. He is coming. He has always been coming. I realized then that the haunting wasn't about the ship. It was about something much older, much darker. And I was just beginning to understand. Christmas came, and with it, a strange peace. The whispers didn't stop, but they changed. Thomas's memories became less a torment and more a companionship. I understood now that he wasn't trying to possess me. He was trying to warn me. Dr. Elizabeth Moreau visited me on Christmas Eve. I hadn't seen her in months, and the concern in her eyes told me I looked as fractured as I felt I brought you something, she said, placing an old leather-bound journal on my desk. It was my grandmother's. She was a maritime historian too. Well, I thought you might appreciate it. The journal belonged to a researcher from the 1930s, someone who had been investigating the Titanic long before modem technology made such research easier. As Elizabeth left, I opened the pages. Tucked between yellowed sheets was a photograph, not of the Titanic, not of any passenger. A man, standing alone on a foggy pier, his face partially obscured, but familiar in a way that made the hair on my neck stand up. The man from Thomas's stolen memory. That night, the wound on my began to speak differently. Thomas's spirit wasn't a victim. He was a guardian. Something grabbed my leg when I ran up the stairs. I can't be the only one. Ever since I was a kid, I would run up the basement stairs because I was scared someone was going to grab my leg. I would be in a full-on sprint, all while trying to hit the light switch on my way up. There was always this constant feeling that something lurked behind me as I was coming back upstairs. In my childhood home, the game room was in the basement. You know what kind of basement I'm talking about. TV down there, Xbox, board games, computer, pool table. Maybe it was me being a dumb kid, but I continued to do it for years. It became a habit for me. Go downstairs, hang out, play games, watch TV. The end of the night would come, and my Olympic training would start. Turn the TV off, swipe for the light as I sprint up the stairs, and then shut the door. Obviously, nothing ever grabbed me. It was just that fear of what was lurking in the dark behind me that gave me goosebumps. I would love to tell you as I got older, I stopped doing it. But I didn't. I was a chicken, and I'm not afraid to admit it. I slept with a nightlight until I was 13. I never left a closet door open when I went to sleep. And even as an adult, I always check the backseat of my car when I get in. My parents are retiring to Florida, and instead of selling the house right away, they decided to ask me if I had any interest in moving back in. The house is paid off, so I would just have to cover utilities. I got a pretty good job right out of college and can afford it, so I figured I would keep the memories alive and move in. The only downside to moving in is that I would be living alone. I did have family close by, which was a plus, but living by myself would be so strange. I lived with my parents until college, and during my college years I always had a roommate, whether I lived in a dorm or an off-campus apartment. The night before my parents were moving out, we had a little going-away party for them. A ton of food and lots of drinks were had. My older sister lived a few blocks away, so the entire family was there. It was a fun yet emotional night. I know my parents weren't leaving forever, and I would still see them, but it still felt like a little piece of me was being taken on their retirement adventures. During the get-together, I pulled my mom to the side and asked if there was anything I should be concerned about when taking on the house. Any leaks, damage, problems, or creepy spirits I should be worried about. I may have presented that last part as a joke, but like I said, I was a chicken and one just slightly concerned about how I would handle living alone. My mom assured me that there were no problems with the house and that once I got used to normal house maintenance, it would be smooth sailing. Jason, you have to keep the house clean. You no longer have the luxury of an unpaid maid. We just remodeled the kitchen not too long ago, so all the appliances are new. My biggest worry with you is your laundry. Really, Ma, my laundry? Yes, Jason. You would always let all your dirty clothes build up, and when you would come visit, I would have to haul all your bags down to the basement and spend what felt like days washing and drying them. I thought you loved doing that, Madre. That's why I would always save it for you, I said with a big grin on my face. My mom nudged me on the arm and walked away, sighing and laughing. I hadn't even thought about that. Not only would I have to be in the house alone, not only would I have to laundry, but I would have to go to the basement alone. I leaned back against the wall and thought to myself, what the hell am I so worried about? I am a grown-ass man. This is the stupidest thing to be concerned about. A basement? That's my biggest concern, being scared of the dark as I run up the stairs? The thought alone made me laugh. It was ridiculous. I needed to grow up. The basement hadn't gotten much use as I got older. I started to go out more and hang with friends and was barely even home. Once I went to college, my visits home consisted only of eating homemade food, seeing family, and going out drinking with friends. The pep talk to myself ended when I heard what sounded like a stampede coming up the basement steps. For a split second, I thought it was in my head until my nephew busted through the basement door. Breathing heavy and in near tears, he ran straight to his mother. "Joey, are you okay? What happened?" my sister asked. Still catching his breath, Joey answered, "Mom, there is something downstairs." "What are you talking about? Why were you in the basement?" I interrupted. "What did you see downstairs?" "I didn't see anything. I was coming up the stairs and someone tried to grab my leg." My sister's husband told his son to calm down and gave him a hug. He told him he would go in the basement and check. While everyone else in the house may think he was just a scared kid whose imagination got the best of him, for some reason I believed him. I can't tell you what it was, but I know he had the same feelings I had as a kid every time I came up those stairs. He felt like something was behind him. I would be lying if I told you I wasn't terrified. I never told anyone about the little routine I had when coming up the stairs from the basement, so nobody else seemed to be concerned. My sister was calming my nephew down as my brother-in-law made his way to the basement. I stood at the top of the stairs and looked down. I watched as he passed by the staircase several times looking around for someone, something, anything. He found nothing. He made his way back upstairs and he assured my nephew there was nothing down there and nothing to worry about. The night ended shortly after that. I said goodbye to my family and went over to hug my nephew. "Uncle Jason, what's up, pal?" "There is something down there. Be careful." He gave me a hug that lasted a bit longer than normal and headed toward the door. I was happy to have my parents stay at the house at least one more night before heading to Florida. After driving them to the airport, I returned back to the house. I walked in the front door and took a deep breath. "This is it," I said to myself. I was on my own in the house now. I turned the lights on in the kitchen and living room, even though the sun was shining through the windows. It just gave me extra comfort knowing the lights were on. It was a safety blanket for me. I began to clean up from last night. Before I knew it, several hours had passed. I got a phone call from my sister. "Jay, do you want to come over for dinner?" "Tonight? Sure, I don't have any plans." "Sorry about Joey last night. He was still a little shaken up even when we got home." "No need to apologize. I just feel bad he was so scared. He practically begged me to invite you over tonight, so I told him I would. I think he feels a little silly about what happened." "Ah, I gotcha. No worries. 7 o'clock. Good?" "Yeah, sounds like a plan. See you then." I rang the doorbell and almost instantly the door swung open. It was Joey. He ran onto the porch and hugged me. "Uncle Jason, you're okay." "Yeah, buddy, I'm okay. Are you?" I said with a not-so-subtle fake laugh. My sister came to the door and grabbed my jacket. She hung it up and made her way towards the kitchen. "Dinner will be ready in 5 minutes. Jack should be getting home from Jenny's soccer practice in a few." I took a seat at the dining room table, and I could feel Joey staring at me. Why was he so concerned? It struck me as odd, but it scared me more than anything else. What the hell did he see in that basement? What did he feel? Jack went to check. No one was down there. In all the years I lived at the house, there were no problems. Even though I ran up those stairs almost every night, nothing ever happened. I chalked it up to me just being a scared kid. "Uncle Jason, did you go in the basement last night when I left?" No, I did not. After seeing you run up those stairs, I wasn't risking it." I smiled at him nervously. "You know, I'm not scared of anything. I was just seeing what old games you had down there." I had the light on. While I was sitting looking at the shelves, someone turned out the lights. "I don't think anyone was close to the basement, buddy." "I heard someone breathing." "What?" "Someone was breathing down there with me." That's when I ran to the stairs. I felt something touch my leg when I opened the door. My sister walked into the dining room with a big tray of pasta. "Food's ready." Jack walked in with Jenny, and the kids went to go wash their handy. If no one could tell I was scared before they could sure as shit see something was wrong now. My sister asked me what's wrong, and I told her I was just starving. I ate tons of food and tried to clear my mind of what Joey told me. I asked my sister if she had any wine. I purposely drank a bit too much, which caused my sister to tell me to just spend the night on the couch so I didn't drive home. I took her up on that offer and crashed on the couch. I didn't sleep much. It was Sunday now. I didn't want to be a burden to my sister and her family anymore, so I said goodbye and headed home. I had work tomorrow and had absolutely no clothes to wear. I had to do some laundry in that basement. I got home and gathered my clothes. I headed for the basement, making sure to hit every light switch on the way. I swung open the basement door and made sure to keep it open. I walked down the steps with my giant load of laundry and threw my clothes in the washing machine. I started it, and just as I went to tum around, I thought I heard a noise. Without hesitation, I headed for the stairs and sprinted up, skipping 4 steps with every lunge. I closed the basement door and realized that I left my phone on the table. That sound I heard was my phone vibrating. I gotta relax. When my clothes were finished washing, I put them in the dryer. When all was done with laundry, I brought it back upstairs. For the next few weeks, I kept my visits to the basement at a minimum. I always had an uneasy feeling whenever I was down there. I always kept the lights on and never closed the door. Even though nothing had happened, I certainly wasn't going to take any chances. It had only been a short while my parents were in Florida, but they wanted to come back for the weekend so they could see the family. I, of course, told my parents that they could stay at the house. This was their house, after all. We decided it would be a fun idea to have game night at the house. Game nights always consisted of good food, lots of laughs, and always arguments. What can I say? We were a competitive family. I grabbed my parents from the airport in the morning, and by dinner time, the rest of the family was over. Joey didn't leave his parents' side from the moment he got there. He was constantly looking around and listening intently to whatever sounds he heard. We played Uno, Sorry, and Trouble, all the classics. There was one big one we hadn't played yet, Monopoly, the ultimate argument maker. One teased my sister about how I used to destroy her in Monopoly, and how she still owes me money from the time she landed on Park Place and quit. After some laughing, I realized Monopoly wasn't upstairs. It was in the basement. Once I relayed the message to everyone that I had to go get it, Joey ran over to me and told me not to go. "Please, Uncle Jason, stay up here. We don't have to play Monopoly. Relax, bud. It will take me 2 seconds. I'll be right back." "No!" he shouted. "Please stay here." Everyone stopped what they were doing and looked over to us. Joey was clinging to me. My sister came over to put him at ease. I told him I wouldn't go down and it was going to be all right. Without anyone noticing, my dad made his way toward the basement door. He just wanted everyone to keep having fun. He figured he could go down, grab the game, and come back up before anyone even realized. Well, we did realize. We realized because we heard the basement door slam and my dad tumble down the staircase. I sprinted over to the door and had to wrestle it open. It felt like someone was holding it from the other side. I finally threw it open and ran down the stairs. Monopoly money lined the basement floor. The game must have flew out of my dad's hand as he fell. He had a nasty bump on his head, but insisted he was okay. I asked him what happened, and he said he didn't know. I grabbed the game and was making my way back up the stairs. I just wanted everyone to keep having a good time. I got to the top of the stairs and the door slammed shut. I lost my balance and down I went. "I'm fine, I swear." I helped my dad back up the stairs and sat him down at the table. My mother was wormed and insisted he go to the hospital to get checked out. She didn't know if he was bleeding internally or maybe even suffered a concussion. I agreed with her and convinced my dad that he should go. As a family, we gathered our things and headed to the hospital. I figured I would need the next couple of days from work off to take care of my dad and make sure he was all right. It wasn't until we got to the hospital that I realized I left my phone back at home. I told my mom and sister that I needed to go home and grab it. Joey overheard us and pleaded to go with me. I looked at my sister and she shrugged. "Please, Uncle Jason, I just want to make sure you are safe." When we walked in the door, something seemed off. I left the lights on when we left, but now they were off. I thought maybe the power went out, but when I hit the switch, the lights came back on. I thought maybe my mom hit them on the way out. I went to grab my phone from the counter when I noticed the basement door. It was closed. I know it was open when I left because once we got my dad back upstairs and we all agreed to go to the hospital, we left soon after and no one went back towards the basement. Curiosity got the best of me. I opened the door. Just as quickly as I opened it, Joey pushed it shut. "Joey, why did you do that? I want to see something." "There's nothing to see. You got your phone. Can we please leave?" I looked at him for a brief moment and reached for the handle. I opened the door and saw the basement light was still on. I took a breath, closed my eyes for a split second, and made my way down. I don't know what I was looking for, but I was compelled to go down there. I heard Joey follow behind me down the stairs. I peered around the comer and saw nothing. Monopoly money still strewn across the floor, but nothing out of the ordinary. I hit the switch with the light still shining from the top of the stairs. "See, nothing to worry about," I said as I tombed around, proudly smiling, having conquered my fear. That's when I looked up and saw Joey standing by the door. He never came down. "Whose footst—" The door slammed shut and the lights went out. That's when I heard it. The breathing. I blindly ran up the stairs, hands stretched out in front, reaching for that door handle. I grabbed it and pushed, but couldn't get through. "Joey, let me out! Open the door! Open the fucking door!" I heard footsteps sprint up the stairs and I felt someone wrap their hands around my leg. The door flew open and I slammed it behind me. I heard clawing at the base of the door and leaned with all of my weight against it. I looked over to my right and saw Joey cowering in the corner with tears pouring down. "Joey, were you holding the door?" Through his screaming cries, he said, "No! I told you something was down there." I grabbed Joey and we ran out of the house. When we got back to the hospital, I brought Joey to my sister and immediately called the police. They came by to investigate the empty house and found nothing in the basement. It wasn't until they came back up the stairs that they saw the claw marks on the door. Whoever, whatever was down there can stay. I'm not. That was my last night in that house. I don't think I'll ever go back. I was hired to watch an abandoned mansion. The rules they left still haunt me. It all started with an ad on the internet, buried deep in a forgotten corner of a job board. I had no real intention of responding to it when I clicked, but there it was. Overnight caretaker needed $500 for a night's work. Light duties, no experience required. I was desperate, so I applied on impulse. 2 hours later, I received an email with just a time and an address. Avery Estate, 9 p.m. Instructions will be provided upon arrival. The estate was about an hour's drive outside of town, nestled in the woods, almost hidden behind a veil of thick branches and vines. The house itself was enormous, but not in a welcoming way. It loomed in the night like something out of a Gothic novel, tall, dark, and imposing. The front door stood ajar, a single dim light flickering inside. I hesitated at first, but I needed the money. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air smelled stale, musty, like the house hadn't been aired out in years. The wooden floors creaked beneath my weight as I moved cautiously through the hall. Nothing moved, nothing stirred. Just the faint hum of the house's aged structure. The entryway was barren, no furniture, no warmth. But there, in the center of the room, was a small table, and on it, a sheet of paper, weighted down by a heavy brass key. I reached for the paper, the cool metal of the key cold in my hand. The note was scrawled hastily in a hand I didn't recognize, but the words were clear. Caretaker rules. Follow exactly one. Lock the front door as soon as you enter. Use the silver key hanging on the hook by the door. It's the only one that works. If the key is missing, leave immediately. Do not look back. 2. Do not enter any room with a lit candle. If you see a candle burning, close the door immediately and lock it. Wait until 3:33 a.m. before unlocking it again. 3. Every hour on the hour, wind the grandfather clock in the parlor. If the clock stops, leave the house. Do not take anything with you. 4. Ignore any knocking you hear. It doesn't matter if it comes from a door, a window, or even the walls. Do not acknowledge it. 5. Avoid the west wing after midnight. If you hear footsteps coming from that direction, go to the kitchen and wait. Do not investigate. 6. If you see her, don't run. She doesn't like it when you run. 7. The job ends at 6 a.m. At 5:59, leave through the back door. Do not look behind you. If you feel cold air on your neck, run. The last line made my stomach twist, but I pushed the feeling aside. It was just an odd list of instructions for some rich person's house, I assumed. Maybe they were just paranoid or superstitious, but I wasn't about to back out now. I turned around and found the silver key hanging on a hook by the door, just like the note said. It was old, worn, but unmistakable. I took the key and looked at the door behind me, and then glanced back at the brass key. It didn't seem to serve any purpose now, so I pocketed it as a curiosity. I started my rounds as instructed. The first rule seemed simple enough. Lock the door as soon as you enter. I felt silly for even worrying about it, but I did it, locking the door behind me with the silver key. I moved deeper into the house. The second rule was the first one that made me uneasy. Do not enter any room with a lit candle. It seemed random, but I kept my eyes peeled for any candles. As I passed one of the rooms, I saw a soft glow from the crack in the door. I crept closer and peeked inside. A small, flickering candle sat on an old oak table, casting long shadows across the room. I swallowed. The second rule was clear. I wasn't supposed to be in here. I slowly stepped back, gently closing the door. I turned the lock with a quiet click and moved on, leaving the candle burning inside. My heart was pounding a little faster now, but nothing seemed too out of the ordinary. After all, this was probably just some rich person's eccentric rules, right? The hours passed with nothing too strange happening, just a couple more flickering candles in random rooms. I kept following the rules locking doors, staying away from lit candles and minding my business as much as I could. Then at 11 p.m., I reached the grandfather clock in the parlor, standing tall and foreboding against the wall. It was a thing of beauty, all brass and dark wood, but its ticking was unsettling, too loud in the silence. I checked the time. 11 p.m. on the dot. I had to wind it. I pulled open the glass case around the clock and grabbed the small winding key. As I twisted it, the clock groaned, the gears turning reluctantly. When I finished, I checked the time again. It had barely moved. Strange. I made a mental note to check it again at midnight. By 12:15 a.m., I was starting to feel like I was just wasting time. No one had shown up, and the house remained as still as a tomb. The silence was deafening, and yet I was becoming more aware of how often I was checking the time. Something about the quiet unnerved me. Then it happened. Knock, knock, knock. It was soft at first, the sound echoing from behind one of the walls. I froze, my mind racing. The fourth rule flashed in my head. Ignore any knocking you hear. I shook my head, telling myself it was just the house settling. I stepped forward, my footsteps slow and deliberate, trying to push the unease out of my mind. But then, the knocking grew louder. Knock, knock, knock. It was coming from the wall behind me. Distinct, too deliberate. I should have listened to the rule and ignored it, but it was too much. I turned around. Nothing. I swallowed hard. It was nothing. Just the house, the old pipes, the wind. I turned back around, ready to leave, but that's when I heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. I covered my ears, fighting the urge to stare in the direction it had come from. I wasn't supposed to acknowledge it. The rules said not to, but it felt like the walls were closing in. I moved on, finally making my way to the kitchen. I had to breathe. But as I entered the room, the door slammed shut behind me. I whirled around, my breath shallow. I stood there, staring at the door for what felt like an eternity, the rules echoing in my head. I checked the time, 3:33 a.m. I could have sworn it was just midnight. I'd broken the knocking rule, but the next one hit me like a brick to the skull. Avoid the West Wing after midnight. I'd passed the West Wing earlier, but now that I was closer to it, I could hear faint footsteps coming from behind the door. Panic surged through me. My heart thudded against my ribs. A sudden scratching noise came from the direction of the West Wing. It was faint, almost imperceptible at first. I froze, holding my breath. The footsteps from earlier hadn't stopped. They had only grown fainter, but now they were accompanied by this strange, unsettling sound, like something or someone was dragging itself across the floor. I tried to follow the rule. Avoid the West Wing after midnight. I didn't investigate, but the scratching, it felt like it was calling me. Something deep in my bones told me to go check, but I pushed it aside, refusing to break the rules. Still, the sound lingered in the back of my mind, gnawing at me like a rat in the walls. By 4:30 a.m., I was pacing the hallway, jumping at every little sound. The house was creaking, groaning, the windows rattling with each gust of wind. I checked every door, every room. I even peeked inside a few with the faintest glow of candles. But the moment I saw that light, I turned away and locked the doors behind me as instructed. But the house seemed more oppressive now. Every step I took felt heavier. Then at 5 a.m., the door to the west wing creaked open. I hadn't touched it. It had simply opened. And for a split second, I thought I saw the shadow of a woman flicker inside. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The air grew colder, sharper. I felt a presence, an intangible force that seemed to be drawing closer. The scratching, now louder, echoed from within. My instinct screamed at me to leave, to break the rules and run. But I couldn't. I wasn't done yet. The clock was ticking down, and I was still bound by the rules. It was 5:45 a.m. now. I moved back into the parlor to check the clock one more time, the ticking now louder than ever. The time read 5:45. I only had 15 minutes. But the house was closing in on me. My heart raced, my mind frantic. I thought I saw something move in the shadows, but when I looked closer, nothing was there. Then I heard it, a voice. It came from the west wing, a faint whisper, soft but unmistakable. "Run!" I froze. My heart thudded in my chest, the cold sweat trickling down my spine. I had to go. The rules said not to look back. The terror was overwhelming. I was seconds away from breaking. The clock struck 5:59 a.m. Without thinking, I ran. My feet hit the floor hard as I bolted down the hallway. The cold air from the back door hit me as I flung it open, stumbling into the night. My breath came in ragged gasps, my legs burning as I sprinted. The gravel crunched underfoot, the trees around me bending and twisting in the wind. I didn't dare look back, but I felt a presence behind me, chasing me. The house seemed to breathe with me, its windows dark and empty, the door I had locked now standing wide open. I threw my car door open and put the pedal to the floor. I didn't stop driving until the distant glow of the city lights was visible on the horizon. Only then did I dare to slow down. My legs trembled, my body exhausted, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop, and I didn't look back. I sat in my car, still shaking, the events of the night replaying in my mind. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. For a split second, I thought about ignoring it. Another rule I'd follow long after leaving the house. But curiosity got the better of me. The notification was an email. Subject, payment confirmation. My breath hitched. I opened it. "Thank you for completing your shift at the Avery Estate. $500 has been deposited into your account." That was it. No apology, no explanation, just cold, clinical confirmation. I refreshed my banking app, and sure enough, the money was there. But something was off. The email came from an address I didn't recognize, something generic like caretaker@jobsportal.com. The sender field didn't link to a company. It felt anonymous, almost like it didn't want to be found. For a brief moment, I thought about replying, demanding answers. But as my fingers hovered over the keyboard, I remembered the house, the knocking, the whispers. Number whatever had just happened, I didn't want to know more. The money was there, and I wasn't about to ask questions that might drag me back into whatever nightmare I'd barely escaped. I closed the email and deleted it from my inbox, along with every trace of that job. But even as I sat there, trying to convince myself it was over, a single thought kept gnawing at me. Who or what paid me, and did I want to know? My job is to watch people die. If you met me on the street and asked me what my job was, I would tell you that I work from home consulting for an industrial laundry company. That is, after all, the cover story I have been provided with. The reality? My job is even simpler. Every Friday night, I dress up nice, report to a certain theater downtown, have a seat, and watch a performance. That's it. All it takes is a couple hours out of my week, and I end up making six figures a year with every benefit you could possibly ask for. I know. I know. It sounds too good to be true. Pretty much anybody on the planet would kill to have a job like mine. At least, perhaps, until they find out just what kind of performances I'm made to attend. Before I start, though, I need you to keep in mind that I'm a good person. I donate thousands to the Rainforest Fund out of every paycheck, and me and my kids volunteer at the food bank weekly. I'm a devout believer, and I'm going to heaven when I die. After all, I myself have never hurt anybody, never raised a hand to injure any living soul. How could you possibly call me a sinner when all I ever do is watch? It started about 3 years ago when their job offer found me when I was at my most desperate. All I was told was every Friday night I would attend a performance at my city's fanciest theater. That was it. I was baffled at first. What the hell do I know about theater or ballet or orchestras? Had they gotten me mixed up with some big shot critic? During our talk on the phone, however, they politely reassured me that no critical ability would be required. All we ask, they said, is for you to be there to bear witness. Everything about it screamed scam, but I figured, what the hell? Worst case scenario, I listen to a pitch for some MLM or timeshare, politely decline, and then walk out with some pocket money. I was baffled when I pulled up to the theater. Dozens, maybe even hundreds of people were streaming in, all in nice suits and gorgeous gowns. I'd thrown on the fanciest clothes I could afford, yet I still felt severely underdressed. The theater was totally rented out by my employer, and only my fellow coworkers were allowed in. How much could it have cost to hire such a massive crowd just to attend this one performance? Who could possibly bankroll something like this? I tried to empty my mind and simply merge into that human tidal wave flowing through the doors. Every staff member was dressed in a refined all-black suit with black tie and undershirt, to the point they seemed to darken the air around them. Each wore a white comedy mask, the neoprene stretched into a grin of perpetual laughter, which struck me as almost mocking. They demanded that we hand over all electronic devices, even patting us down and running a metal detector over us. Then they reminded all attending not to leave their seats under any circumstances during the performance, recommending we take bathroom breaks before the show started, and to remain quiet and to keep our eyes open. They kept repeating the same mantra: no distractions, no diversions, no lapses in concentration. Remember, you are here to bear witness. If I'd been alone, I would have left right then and there. There was a tickling in the back of my brain, some primate part of me screaming that there was something terribly wrong. Here, but mob mentality is a hell of a thing. Everybody else seemed calm, nonplussed, handed their phones over without a fuss. There were a few holdouts, probably other newbies like me, but eventually they too relented. If everyone else is going along with it, I figured, why shouldn't one? Who wants to be the one single paranoid bastard who missed out on an easy paycheck? Stepping into a gorgeous theater like something out of 3 centuries ago, I was most struck by the make of the stage. It looked like the back action of a piano, strange levers, and mahogany hammers looking like fingers manipulating countless lines of piano wire, some over a dozen feet long. All the taut wires stretched in bizarre formations across the stage reminded me somehow of a spider's web. I could not fathom a machine so complex, yet with such little apparent purpose. The nature of the performance always varies. Sometimes it's a work of Shakespeare, a ballet, an opera, hell, even a puppet show. That day it was a concert featuring a small chamber orchestra of around 35. Students, it looked like, young and inexperienced, with a nervous air about them as if this was their first time performing before such a crowd. Mostly a string section, plus one of each woodwind and just a couple each on horns and percussion. The conductor was one of the staff members in the comedy masks. I was baffled. Who would put forward this much cash just for a small green orchestra to play in such a massive, prestigious venue? One of them must be a billionaire's kid, I figured. It was the only explanation. This I've since realized is always the best part. The beginning of the performance when you can, if you try, lose yourself in the display and pretend everything is okay, that it's all normal. It was best on those lucky days when the performers on stage were completely unaware of just what sort of danger they were in. That always makes it easier for everybody. On that first day, I was as oblivious as they were and simply enjoyed the music. Maybe some snob of the orchestral arts would hear their amateurish mistakes, but to my untrained ear, they sounded just fine. Pleasant even. But one question began to worm its way into my head, a small nagging at first, which crescendoed into a hammering on the inside of my skull. How much time has passed? At a certain point, I suspected the intermission was long overdue, but there were no windows, and I had to part with my electronic wristwatch at the door. So really getting any sense of time was impossible. I dismissed it as my lousy attention span at first, but eventually others began taking notice. No one dared speak, but among the fellow newbies, I noticed furrowed brows and sideways glances, confused and concerned. The performers seemed to be getting restless as well, whispering and gesturing to each other and the conductor, who never ceased those robotic, sweeping motions of his gloved hands. It must have been 2 hours by then, if I had to guess, and they were starting to look exhausted, dehydrated. Some even looked as if they were about to quit playing. Continue performing. In a moment, all of the piano wire loudly reverberated and stretched taut with the movements of those mechanical contraptions on stage, as the whole thing bristled and tensed as though it were a living thing. And that voice, cracking like thunder, seemed to emerge from the stage itself with a mechanical roar like the grinding of metal on metal. That seemed to frighten them into submission for a while. It wasn't until a half-hour later that my life changed irreparably. They'd been playing a quiet sonata, so everybody could hear the sudden fur-ting, accompanied by a pained yelp. My eyes leapt to one of the violinists. One of her strings had broken and happened to snap her right in the eye. It could see the streak of scarlet bifurcate her pupil, before the emerging blood replaced the entire eye with a thick redness. She stood, clutching a hand over her eye and blindly grasping with the other, gesturing toward medical help. And as she did so, that strange lattice of levers and hammers and pulleys all roared and clacked to life, like a bear trap being sprung. The machine's efficacy was just as sudden, just as brutal. Those clockwork edifices moved like a pair of robotic arms, aiming a wire for her neck as if trying to garrote her. But they moved at such a speed that the wires seemed to pass through her, like she wasn't even there. For a moment she seemed fine, unaffected, as if nothing had happened at all. And then things began to fall off of her. Her head, severed at the neck, alongside the hand she'd been holding over her eye, and the very fingertips of her other hand, with which she'd been grasping a little too high. All had been cut cleanly, with surgical precision. Time seemed to slow as they all went clattering wetly to the floor, and the girl's body soon followed, as if it took a few moments for gravity to set in. Or perhaps for her body to realize she was dead. It happened so fast it was hard to be properly horrified. It was more like awe, maybe. Everybody stared at the chunks of meat that had once been a promising young woman with hopes and dreams. That spider web of wires was still rumbling and shaking all around them, and the mechanical voice roared once more. Continue performing. They were given no further warnings. A few of them jumped from their seats out of sheer instinct, not even thinking. None of them made it more than a step before the wires divided them in twain. The rest just kept playing exactly as they had been, as if their brain froze up at what they'd witnessed and simply ran on autopilot, until their faculties slowly returned to them and they realized that this instinct had saved their lives. Where once beauty filled the room, now the orchestra had been reduced to a discordant sound like a long, shuddering whine, like a mocking parody of music. They gripped their instruments with trembling, sweaty hands, playing just well enough to avoid stoking the ire of those quivering wires stretched taut all around them. They realized gradually that they were allowed to speak. Immediately they began wailing hard enough almost to mercifully drown out that dismal cacophony that was once music, some begging and pleading with the staff, others screaming out threats, be they legal or physical. Nothing they said could shake the masked men and women in the slightest. They stood at order like statues, unflinching. Realizing this, they turned their attention to us, a wall of red, weepy eyes scanning the crowd for any hint of mercy, begging us to band together against the staff, calling us all sick bastards for just sitting there and watching them die. A blonde woman on violin had the most genius and cruel strategy of all. She merely began telling us about herself. Everything she could think of poured out in between sniffles and tears. My end name is Vera H. Hayes. That's my husband over there. She gestured to a dark-haired man on drums. He'd been the quietest of them all, seeming to be saving his strength. We have a little girl. She's 8 years old and she loves her mom and papa. Her name is El Lucy. S- She loves horses and I was saving us to maybe give her riding lessons one day. I desperately wanted to cover my ears, but knew it would be against the rules. Why can't she just shut the hell up? One thought bitterly, grinding my teeth. I truly hated her. Hated her more than I'd ever hated before. But why? Some dim remnant of my reason asked. She's a victim here. She's done you no wrong. But I realized I hated her because she kept reminding me she was human. Reminded me of what I was doing to her. What we all were doing to her, sitting here in complicity. And it almost worked too. I almost resolved to save her. But then came the boom of a gunshot from far behind me. The shot had come from one of the tragedians standing amid the upper gallery, I was certain. I almost made the mistake of looking back. Instead, I kept my eyes locked forward and merely imagined who it was that just had their brains splattered across their seat. Had they snuck a phone in and tried calling 911? Had they tried making a break for it? Or maybe they just couldn't take it anymore and made the fatal decision to look away from the horror. I tried to distract myself by studying the impossible mechanism animating the blood-soaked piano wire. I couldn't figure it out. It was an impossible machine, existing in defiance all basic laws of geometry, and seemed to have no means of controlling it, instead operating automatically with some malign intelligence. Perhaps it was an extension of whatever creature composed the stage itself. It was a living thing. Of that much I was certain. It breathed beneath the performers, and their blood soaked into its floorboards in moments, as if consumed. After some hours, the orchestra had gone quiet, having screamed themselves hoarse. I couldn't imagine being in their shoes. Even just watching them perform was a test of endurance. Many of them were oozing blood all over their instruments, from scarlet cuts where the skin had split. The woman on the French horn was struggling hardest of all, her lungs and hands burning with exhaustion. "I can't," she eventually cried out in a hoarse little wheeze, horn slamming to the floor as her body gave out. "I'm so sorry, I can't do any." A wire passed through flesh in an instant, and suddenly she had no mouth to speak, no eyes to see, no mind to think with. All of it lay splattered upon the stage, which sated itself upon that spilled VD. Another gunshot. I quivered in my seat, sweat beading on my forehead from the terror. Somebody in the audience had looked away, and I realized I had just been about to do the same thing, had the sudden sound not knocked me out of my stupor. Most of the performers went in similar ways over the next few hours, either making mistakes or their bodies giving out. As monstrous as it may sound, I was quietly praying for them to get it over with. They were dead the moment that they walked on stage. Why drag it out for all these hours, just for the inevitable to happen anyway? I recognize now that it's almost impossible to make that choice, to simply give in and accept death in defiance of all our natural instincts. But the auditorium now reeked from audience members voiding their bowels, and the damn woman next to me just wouldn't stop crying, wouldn't stop at all. Vera and her husband lasted the longest of all, perhaps because they had each other. Over a dozen hours had passed, maybe even two, and they were still playing a little duet in perfect sync, despite everything. By now, they were simply talking to each other as if nothing was wrong, as if we weren't even watched. "Baby, when we get out of here, I'm going to take you to Martha's Vineyard. I know I've been saying that for so long, but God, I wasted so much money on that stupid fucking motorcycle," he said. "Lucy's going to love it." Vera chuckled. "I don't know, it might be boring for a little girl. Isn't it all a bunch of old people up there?" He laughed weakly. "Oh, maybe in town. But you know her. Once you get her in the water, you can't get her back out. She's a natural-born swimmer, I swear. Think we'll see her in the Olympics someday?" Ha 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 ha. It was surreal to watch, like I was peeking in on a private conversation a couple was having in their own home. But I could tell both of them were trying to maintain some illusion of normalcy, anything to keep themselves psychologically intact as the hours pass. Even as they tried to smile and laugh, there was a quiver in their tone, a desperation, a fear of what might happen if there was a single break in the conversation. A lot of what they said was too personal to relay here. They went into old regrets, past mistakes, resolved every argument they ever had in all their years together. It was like they wanted to make sure they said everything they had to say before the end came. I think I owe them, at least, their privacy. But the husband was slowly deteriorating. He'd moved too quick, caught the symbol with his hand, leaving a wide gash along his palm that was gushing blood at a terrifying rate. Now he was getting woozier and woozier, swaying dizzily, his eyes unfocusing, his speech becorning, slurred, and his playing sloppy. Vera desperately tried to keep him focused. "Talk to me, baby. Think of the beach. Lucy's going to love the seashells. She'll pick her favorite and put it on that little stand in her room, with all her little trophies." She rambled on, but by the end, all he could manage was half-hearted grunts of affirmation. He was leaning in his seat, and then his drumstick went flying right out of his hand, sending a cloud of pink mist through the air along its path. And yet he kept going through the motions of playing, as if he didn't even notice. Then a sudden clarity formed in his eyes, and he stared at his empty hand in disbelief. And then the piano wire was tensing and strumming all around him. And then, in an instant, he was up from his seat and racing towards us. He knew it was over. He just wanted to strike out at the world if he could. One last act of defiance. He even locked eyes with me, and I'll never forget the look on his face. "Why are you watching this? You sick bastards! You sick, twisted—" He threw his remaining drumstick, and the trajectory would have delivered it right to me. But the piano wires lacerated it in midair, slicing into it from 100 different directions until it disappeared into a cloud of sawdust. And then they did the same to him. Vera didn't scream or sob. She just tensed and let out the tiniest little gasp. Like when you're at the doctor's and know the shot is inevitable, but it still stings anyway. And then she was all alone. She looked at us like she wanted to speak, wanted to say something, to express what was happening inside her. But what was there left to say? She'd spent almost a full day screaming herself hoarse with every combination of words she could think of. None of it helped. None of it meant anything. Instead, she expressed herself through music. She began to play the most mournful, sabering solo I had ever heard, one I knew she making up as she went along, one with which she communicated those parts of herself that words could not encompass. She stared us all down, eyes red and bloodshot, making eye contact individually as if to remind us that we were not a shapeless mass, that we were all individually responsible. I only barely remember the sound of it now, as if I'd heard it in a dream, and yet even now the memory tears at my heart. She performed for what felt like an eternity, and then, in the end, she slowly, calmly set down her violin, stood up, and took a bow. And then she was unmade. Everyone stood up around me all of a sudden, and I was immediately caught up in it too, performing a standing ovation that dragged on and on. We screamed, shouted, cried, threw things, smashed our fists against seats, tore at our hair, laughed and danced with each other. It was the ultimate catharsis after all that silence, after a full day of holding it all in. Never before had I felt so connected to a crowd of people on some deep, spiritual level. We marched out of the theater, stumbling like a procession of ghouls with blank faces and tired eyes. The staff were as polite as ever, thanking us for attending the performance and hoping that we enjoyed the show. Some were dragging the bodies of shot audience members out of the theater. As I finally emerged into the outside world, I was stunned to find it was still the same night I had entered. At least 20 hours had passed inside that theater. I was sure of it. But for the outside world, only 2 hours had passed. Exactly the duration listed on their job offer. I'd never been explicitly told not to reveal what I'd seen there, and now I knew why. Nobody believed me, or worse, maybe they were covering it up. I swear to God, the police dispatcher laughed at me over the phone. I swore I'd never go back. I'd been part of something evil, something unfathomable, and it would haunt me forever. But the next year was one of constant desperation, debt climbing as job opportunities declined at equal rates. I held out for about a year, but eventually I gave in. And to my horror, the next performance was easier now that I knew what to expect. And then the next was easier still, and the next. The performance is always different, but the end result is always the same. I have to remind myself that I'm not culpable for what they're doing there. All I do is watch. We watch people die every day, in the news and online. People suffering horrible fates, often in places our own countries help to destabilize. How are my actions any different, really? We all have to accept that terrible things happen in this world, and all we can do about them is either look away or look the horror right in the eye. Is choosing to look away more moral, or is it only more cowardly? And besides, wouldn't it be worse for them if there wasn't an audience? If they had to die there in the dark alone? No one seeing, no one caring, no one remembering. After all, someone has to bear witness.